Hey everyone, my name is Richard, and today we will be putting together a small form factor APU PC in the Inwin Chopin Pro case. Now this is going to be the first time that I'm doing a PC build guide on this channel, and I think it's a pretty good time as well considering that a lot of the components have dropped down significantly in price over the past year or so. So what I'm going to do is just introduce all these components, give you guys a detailed tutorial on how to build this PC, and finally show some of the benchmarks for the CPU that we're going to be using in this build. Let's get into it. Now, the star of the show here is obviously the Inwin Chopin Pro case. And some of you guys might be wondering why I chose small form factor and not to mention an APU case for this kind of build. And the reason is because this is actually for my father and he wants something that is relatively small and portable. And he doesn't play games either, so a discrete GPU was not needed. I looked online for several case options around that size, and in the end I landed on the Inwin Chopin Pro. And this is pretty good as well because this case is readily available on sites like Amazon, whereas a lot of the other boutique ITX cases are either really expensive or have extremely long waiting times. It's a pretty popular case within the small form factor community and it's very compact and portable. But one potential problem will be the fact that because this is an APU case, you can add a discrete graphics card later on if you need it for graphically intensive software. So you're essentially stuck with using the integrated graphics on your CPU. But for the purposes of this build, we're not going to be using a discrete graphics card anyway, and this PC will be mainly used for web browsing and running non-intensive software. So that's not really a problem here, but just keep that in mind if you're building this kind of system. Something else that's special about this case is that it actually comes with a 200 watt A+ gold power supply. The original Inwin Chopin only had a 150 watt A+ bronze unit, but the new Pro version has the upgraded A+ gold unit, so it'll be more efficient and run a bit quieter. Another cool thing about this case is that in the back there's also multiple places where you can mount 2.5-inch drives. And this is really useful if you ever want to upgrade your storage because the motherboard that we'll be working with only has one M.2 slot. But since there are multiple SATA connectors, you can just add extra SATA SSDs or hard drives in the back if you need them. For the CPU, I chose the Core i3-12100 from Intel. Now in my opinion, this is one of, if not the best budget CPUs that you can currently buy. 4 cores and 8 threads is more than enough for what this PC will be used for, but if you are going to be playing games on a build like this, I would strongly recommend checking out the Ryzen 5 5600G or the Ryzen 7 5700G. And the only reason for that is because the integrated graphics on those CPUs are more powerful than what Intel currently offers on their desktop CPUs. For CPU cooling, I'm just going to be sticking with the Intel SoC cooler. It does get a bit loud if you're running very intensive programs, which I'll show later, but if you want, you can always add a cooler like the Noctua NH-L9i, but do keep in mind that the maximum height for the CPU cooler is only 43mm in this case. For the motherboard, I'll be using the ASRock B66CM ITX AC. There's nothing really special about this ITX board. It's quite affordable and will get the job done for this build. As mentioned before, you only have one M.2 slot, but there are multiple SATA connectors that you can connect SSDs or hard drives to. You have a decent amount of I/O ports at the back, and it also comes with Wi-Fi if you need that. For the RAM, I chose to go with the Teamgroup Vulcan 16GB DDR4 memory. It's standard in terms of speed at 3200 MHz CL16, and I was able to get this for only $43. The M.2 SSD is also made by Teamgroup and it's their MP33 version. Once again, this is also a very good value right now because I was able to get this 1TB drive for only around $50. But yeah, that will be it for the parts roundup for this build. Let's put this thing together and see how well it performs. So the first thing that you want to do is of course install everything onto the motherboard. To install the CPU, simply lift the latch holding the CPU socket cover in place, gently insert the CPU with the triangle lining up with the triangle on the motherboard, and put the latch back down. The CPU socket cover will sort of pop off when you do this, and make sure to keep it somewhere safe in case you need to RMA your board. The next thing you want to do is install the RAM and the M.2 SSD. For the RAM, you just have to push it into the slots until it clicks into place, and for the SSD, you just have to insert it sideways into the slot and hold it down using the small Phillips head screw that comes with your motherboard. You will need to use a smaller bit for this screw, so just keep that in mind when building the computer. Finally, we are going to install the CPU cooler. Unlike aftermarket coolers, Intel SoC coolers use a push-pin mounting system. So all you have to do is just line it up with the 4 holes surrounding the CPU socket, push the pins in to secure it, and make sure to plug in the CPU fan cable to the correct pin on your motherboard. After the motherboard is done, it's now time to work with the case. The first thing I recommend would be to straighten out the cables and kind of pull them outside of the case so they don't get in the way when you install your motherboard. The next thing you want to do is install the I/O shield. This step is easier if the shield is integrated on your motherboard because you don't have to use force to insert it, but be careful to not install the I/O shield upside down because otherwise you'll have to take it out and redo it. Once the I/O shield is in, gently slide the motherboard into place and use the motherboard screws that came with the case to hold it in place in the screw holes of the board. So with that, your motherboard is now installed, and it's time to move on to what I think is the most difficult part of this PC build, which is connecting up all the cables and managing them. Now the first thing that I did was actually plug in the motherboard HD audio connector because that was all the way on the bottom left of the board, and it would have been difficult if I plugged it in last. After that, I plugged in the front panel connector on the bottom right of the board, along with the CPU EPS power connector on the top left of the board. And now it's time to move on to the 24-pin motherboard cable. So this one is quite difficult because there's also a SATA connector that's kind of daisy chained to it. What I ultimately did was just plug in the 24-pin normally, and then hide the extra wires in the SATA connector in the front of the case. Speaking of which, I did some cable management to the rest of the build before plugging in the USB 3.0 connector. For the HD audio and CPU EPS power cables, there is a small area above the board where you can kind of hide them, and I ended up zip tying them to the case. Then I just hid the extra wires from the 24-pin cable and the daisy chain SATA connector in the front. There is a decent amount of space there for cable management. Finally, I plugged in the USB 3.0 cable. I left the USB 3.0 connection for last because it's a pain to remove, and sometimes you can actually rip the connector off of the board if you're not careful. Then you can just hide the extra USB 3.0 cable in the front of the case. Once you're done, put all the side panels back on, connect the Wi-Fi antennas to the back of the motherboard, and the build is now complete. I have to say, after building my first small form factor system, it's remarkable how small this PC is compared to a traditional ATX mid-tower. Now, I know that some people might not appreciate SFF that much, and that's completely fine since you are a bit limited in terms of what components you can choose. But overall, for me, I really enjoy it, and I think that in the future, if I build a PC for myself, it's definitely going to be using an SFF case. After you're finished building, you want to power on and enter the BIOS. Assuming there is nothing wrong with the components and installation process, you should boot straight into the BIOS by pressing the delete key on your keyboard. Once you're in the BIOS, double check to make sure that everything is showing up correctly, like your memory and your SSD. If you want, you can turn on XMP profiles for your memory right now, but I personally wait until Windows 11 is installed to do that, just in case the memory is unstable using those profiles. Now speaking of which, I will be installing Windows 11 on this PC. All you have to do is just download a copy of Windows from the Microsoft website, put it onto a clean USB drive with at least 8 GB of storage, and just insert it into one of the USB ports when you first boot the computer up. As soon as you exit the BIOS, you should end up on the Windows installation screen, and then just follow the installation process from there. One minor issue that I kind of ran into with this build was that you actually need internet to install Windows 11, and the problem is this motherboard doesn't come with working Ethernet or Wi-Fi drivers out of the box. So I was kind of in this funny situation where I couldn't install the OS because I didn't have the internet, but there was no way to actually get the internet either. Thankfully though, if you go on the support page for the B660M ITX AC motherboard, there is a section that tells you exactly how to install Windows 11 without the internet. I'm not exactly sure why Windows doesn't just let you click on an option where you can install Windows 11 without the internet, but hey, it is what it is and we got everything up and running. Finally, let's talk about the performance of the system. Now, because there is no discrete GPU, the main focus will be on the CPU performance and temperatures. In the future, I might record a separate video focusing on gaming on the integrated graphics of the 12100. Starting off in Cinebench R23, the 12100 scored 1,850 points on the single-core test and 8,380 points on the multi-core test. This is a very strong showing for a quad-core CPU. For reference, my 12600K gets 1,900 points on the single-core test. In the Blender 3.5 benchmark, the 12100 got a combined score of 115 points on the Monster, Junkyard, and Classroom scenes. When it comes to temperatures, the PC did surprisingly well given how it's using a stock cooler. Temperatures were recorded using Hardware Info 64 alongside a Cinebench R23 multi-core benchmark. The CPU reached a maximum of 78 degrees during this time, and on average the CPU temperature was 72 degrees. Considering that we're working with a stock cooler here, these results are pretty respectable. If you want to improve the CPU temperatures, you should look into getting an aftermarket low-profile cooler that can fit in the Inwin Chopin Pro, such as the Noctua L9i or the Thermalright AXP90. So yeah, there you have it, a small form factor APU PC in the Inwin Chopin Pro. I have always wanted to put together a small form factor PC, so this was definitely very fun for me to build. I will say that the most difficult parts, at least for me, were probably the cable management or maybe the Windows installation process. But overall, those are relatively easy problems to address as long as you take your time and go through the build slowly. Performance is what you expect from a 12100. It's more than enough and very good for web browsing. But if you are going to be playing games, I look into getting a Ryzen APU for that, like the Ryzen 5 5600G or the Ryzen 7 5700G. But yeah, that will be it for this PC build. I'll have all the parts linked down below in the description if you're interested in checking them out. And please let me know if you have any questions about this PC build down in the comments. But for now, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video.